Sergeant James Mitchell's boots crunched against the jagged rocks of the alien world. The sky overhead was dark, streaked with the violent purple clouds of a storm that raged just out of reach. The air was thick with the smell of burning metal and the acrid scent of alien dust. The battle had torn through the capital city of the alien Empress, leaving behind a wasteland of destruction. He could hear the distant echoes of explosions, the thud of heavy boots marching closer, the screech of alien ships above. Jimmy's heart was heavy, not just with the weight of the fight, but with the knowledge that everything was slipping away. The humans had come to this planet as allies, hoping to form a bond with the alien people. Instead, everything had crumbled into chaos, and now it was every soldier for himself. The betrayal had been swift. His fellow soldiers had abandoned their posts. They had retreated without a second thought, leaving him alone to guard the Empress. They had left her to face her people's enemies alone, but not Jimmy. He couldn't walk away, not when the stakes were this high. The Empress was more than just an alien ruler. She was their last hope for peace. If she fell, the galaxy would fall with her. Jimmy's fingers tightened around the grip of his rifle. He was exhausted, his body battered from the hours of combat, but he wouldn't stop. He couldn't. His orders had been clear: protect the Empress at all costs. He would honor those orders no matter what. As he reached the palace gates, he saw it, the final line of defense. Alien soldiers, the Empress's elite guards, were fighting valiantly, but the enemy numbers were overwhelming. The palace walls had already been breached, and the air was thick with smoke and fire. Jimmy's chest tightened. The sight made him sick. His heart ached for her. There was only one thought in his mind: I will not let her fall. He moved forward, slipping through the wreckage, moving with quiet precision. The guards barely noticed him, too focused on the chaos around them. Jimmy ducked into a shadowed alcove, his eyes scanning the courtyard. There, standing alone among the carnage, was Empress Kara. She was magnificent. Even amidst the destruction, she stood tall, regal in her battle armor, her silver hair falling in waves around her shoulders. Her alien features, her violet eyes, her sharp cheekbones, the curve of her jaw were beautiful, but there was something in the way she carried herself that made her even more commanding. The strength she radiated was undeniable. But what Jimmy noticed most was the look in her eyes. It wasn't fear. It wasn't doubt. It was something deeper, a quiet sorrow that clung to her like a shadow. She had seen so much pain in her lifetime, and now, in the heat of this battle, she stood alone. "Your Majesty," Jimmy said, his voice barely a whisper as he stepped into view. Her eyes snapped to him, and for the briefest moment, a flicker of surprise crossed her face. "Sergeant Mitchell," she said, her voice strong but tinged with something else, relief perhaps, or gratitude. "I thought you had abandoned me like the others." Jimmy shook his head, his eyes hard. "I made a promise, Empress. I'm not going anywhere. Not now, not ever." Her gaze softened, but only for a moment. She turned back toward the battlefield, her expression hardening. "You're too late. The enemy has already breached the inner walls. There is no escaping this." He moved beside her, standing tall, his rifle aimed at the enemy soldiers advancing toward them. "Then we'll fight together. I'm not leaving your side." For a long moment she said nothing. The two of them stood there, the roar of battle echoing around them. The wind picked up and the dust swirled in the air, stinging their skin. There were no other soldiers left, no one else to help them, only the two of them. Kara glanced at him, her violet eyes searching his face as if trying to find some sign of weakness. "You are a human," she said softly, almost as if she were speaking to herself. "Why do you fight for me, for someone who is not your own kind?" Jimmy met her gaze without hesitation. "Because you're the only one who's ever stood for peace. You're the only one who's ever tried to do what's right. And if that means standing by your side until the end, then I'll do it. I swore an oath, Empress, and I'll keep it." She was silent for a moment, her eyes searching his face. Then, with a quiet nod, she raised her weapon. "Then we fight." Together they stepped forward, ready to face the oncoming storm. Their backs were to the palace walls, but they weren't afraid. They weren't alone anymore. They had each other. The first wave of enemy soldiers charged, and Jimmy squeezed the trigger. Plasma rounds shot through the air, and the sound of weapons clashing rang through the courtyard. Kara was beside him, her energy blades cutting through the enemy like a storm, her movements graceful and deadly. Jimmy's heart raced, but he didn't flinch. His rifle was steady in his hands, his shots hitting their marks every time. They fought side by side, a human soldier and an alien empress, bound by loyalty, respect, and a shared sense of duty. They were the last hope, and they would not fail. As the battle raged on around them, Jimmy glanced at Kara. There was no turning back now. Together, they would either survive or die together. And in that moment, as they fought against impossible odds, he knew one thing for sure: he would never leave her side. The battle outside the palace raged on, louder now as the enemy forces pressed in closer. Inside the throne room, the air was thick with tension. Empress Kara stood tall, her back straight despite the pain that gripped her side. Her silver armor was stained with blood, her own blood, and yet she didn't allow herself to falter. The sound of gunfire and the distant screams of her people echoed through the grand hall, but she remained unwavering. Beside her, Sergeant Jimmy Mitchell tightened his grip on his rifle, his eyes scanning the battlefield outside the shattered windows. He had been fighting alongside her for hours, and though his body ached and his hands shook from exhaustion, he knew they couldn't stop now. Not when the Empress still stood by him, still fought alongside him. He couldn't let her down. The courtyard was chaos. The enemy was everywhere, their alien soldiers marching forward with relentless force, their weapons blazing with deadly precision. They had breached the inner walls of the palace, and now they were closing in on the heart of the Empress's stronghold. Kara's guards had fought valiantly, but they had been overwhelmed. Now it was only the two of them, human and alien, against an entire army. "You're hurt," Jimmy said softly, his gaze flicking to the blood soaking through the Empress's armor. He had noticed the deep gash on her side earlier, but she had refused his help, focusing only on the battle ahead. The sight of her injury made his heart tighten, but he refused to show it. She was strong. She had always been strong. Kara's violet eyes met his, and for a moment there was something vulnerable in her gaze, a flicker of doubt, of fear. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the fierce determination that Jimmy had come to admire. She was a leader, a ruler, and no matter the cost, she would never stop fighting for her people. "I'll be fine," she said, her voice steady, though Jimmy could hear the faintest strain in it. "We don't have the luxury of rest, Sergeant." He nodded, but the worry didn't leave his face. "We're running out of time." The words hung in the air, unspoken fear written in both of their eyes. They had been holding off the enemy for what felt like an eternity, but the reinforcements they had hoped for never came. The human soldiers had abandoned them. The Empress's people had retreated. Now it was just him and her, fighting, surviving, hopping for a miracle. "Where are the others?" Jimmy asked, unable to keep the edge of frustration from his voice. "Where is your army? Where is your support?" Kara's face tightened. She turned away, her hand gripping the hilt of her energy blade as she walked to the shattered window. Her eyes scanned the battlefield below, her expression unreadable. "They've abandoned us," she said softly, but the pain in her voice was clear. "The ones I trusted, the ones who swore loyalty to me, when the tide of battle turned, they fled." The words were like a knife to Jimmy's chest. He had seen it, too. The way the other soldiers had hesitated when the first wave of enemies came. The way they had turned and run when the fight got too hard. But hearing Kara say it, seeing the heartbreak in her eyes, made it feel real. They had left her. They had left her to die. "Not all of us abandoned you," Jimmy said, stepping forward. "I'm still here. I'm not leaving your side, Empress. Not now, not ever." Kara turned to him then, and her eyes softened for a brief moment. She studied him, the human who had stayed when no one else did, the human who had promised to protect her when the rest of her people turned their backs. For a moment she didn't speak. Instead, she reached out, her hand resting on his shoulder. Her touch was surprisingly gentle, but the weight of it carried something far deeper, a silent thank you, a connection that spoke more than words ever could. "I never asked for this," she whispered, her voice quiet but strong. "I never asked to lead my people into war. I never wanted to be a queen, but I do not regret it, not when I see you standing here with me." Jimmy met her gaze, his heart swelling with a mixture of loyalty and something more. He couldn't deny it anymore. The bond between them, the connection that had formed in the heat of battle, was undeniable. She was an alien empress, a ruler of a species so different from his own. But to him, she was more than just that. She was strong, brave, and fiercely determined. She was someone worth fighting for. "You're not alone," he said quietly, his voice firm. "I'm here and I'll stay. We'll fight through this together." The words hung in the air for a long moment. Kara's eyes locked onto his, and for the first time she didn't look like a ruler. She looked like a woman, someone who had been fighting for too long, someone who was tired but unwilling to give up. She had led her people through countless battles, but now she was fighting for survival, not just for her people but for herself. She nodded slowly, the faintest of smiles tugging at the corner of her lips. "Together," she repeated, "we'll fight together." With that, they turned back to the battle. The enemy was still advancing, their forces massive, but Kara and Jimmy were no longer alone in this fight. They were in this together, and no matter how hopeless it seemed, they would stand until the very end. The Empress's struggle was far from over, but as long as Jimmy stood by her side, there was still hope. They would not give up, not yet, not ever. The sounds of the battle outside had grown louder, the enemy's attacks relentless as they pounded against the palace gates. Jimmy's heart hammered in his chest as he glanced at Empress Kara. They had fought side by side for hours, each wave of enemies pushing them further toward the brink of collapse. Sweat covered Jimmy's brow, his muscles aching from the constant movement, but his focus never wavered, not while she stood beside him. Kara was wounded, there was no denying it. The blood on her armor was darkening, a stark contrast against the bright silver plating. She had insisted she could keep fighting, but Jimmy could see the strain in her movements. Her energy was faltering, but her resolve was still as strong as it had ever been. "We can't keep this up forever," Jimmy said, his voice low, his eyes scanning the broken palace walls for any sign of a way out. Kara's violet eyes met his, and in them he saw the same exhaustion that had taken hold of him. But there was also a quiet strength, a determination to never give up. She had led her people through wars, through famine, through loss. And yet here she was, standing tall despite the odds, unwilling to abandon her people. "We can't retreat," she said, her voice steady but laced with pain. "I won't abandon this city. I won't leave the people I've sworn to protect." Her words hit Jimmy harder than he expected. He understood her desire to fight. She was a ruler, bound by duty and honor. But it tore at him to see her pushing herself to the brink, to know that she was sacrificing her health, and maybe even her life, for something that seemed so out of reach. He took a step closer, his hand resting lightly on her arm. "Empress, you've already given everything. We've done everything we can." Kara's gaze softened for a moment, the weight of the battle pressing heavily on her shoulders. She had always been a symbol of strength, but right now, in this quiet moment, she allowed herself to show her vulnerability. "I cannot leave them," she whispered, almost to herself. "I cannot let my people fall." Jimmy's heart broke at the words. He had never seen someone so devoted, so willing to sacrifice everything for others. It was a rare strength, one that made her more than just a ruler. It made her human, despite her alien origins. "I know," he said gently, his voice full of understanding. "But you can't do this alone. You don't have to." Her eyes met his, searching, as if looking for something that would make the weight of her decision easier to bear. "If I fall, then who will stand in my place?" she asked, the question heavy in the silence between them. Jimmy didn't answer immediately. His mind raced, the enemy forces closing in faster than he could process. But one thing was certain, he would not leave her. He couldn't. Not when they had come so far together. "You don't have to stand alone, Empress," he said finally, his voice full of determination. "I'm here. I'll always be here. And I won't let you face this alone. If we're going down together." Kara stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then slowly she nodded. She didn't speak, but the look in her eyes said everything. She wasn't just a ruler anymore. She was someone who needed help, who needed someone to fight by her side. The sounds of the battle outside were growing louder, more urgent. Jimmy could hear the pounding of alien boots against the palace floor. They didn't have much time left. "Then let's finish this," Kara said, her voice steady again. She straightened, her hand gripping the hilt of her energy blade. The fire that had once flickered in her eyes was now burning bright, the same fire that had made her a leader worthy of her people's loyalty. Jimmy nodded, his rifle tightening in his grip. Together. The two of them rushed toward the palace gates, their footsteps in sync. As they reached the outer courtyard, they were met by a wave of enemy soldiers, their alien weapons raised and ready to strike. But neither Kara nor Jimmy hesitated. They fought as one, side by side, cutting through the enemy lines with the precision of soldiers who had fought together for years. Kara's energy blades flashed through the air, cutting down foes with a single strike, while Jimmy's rifle never stopped firing. Together, they were unstoppable, moving with a rhythm that spoke of trust and shared purpose. But even with all their strength, even with the fire in their hearts, the enemy numbers were overwhelming. Jimmy could feel the tide beginning to shift, could see the exhaustion in Kara's movements, the way her energy was waning. She was slowing down, and the realization hit him like a blow to the chest. They couldn't keep this up forever. Suddenly, a blast rocked the courtyard, throwing them both to the ground. Jimmy's vision swam, and his ears rang with the deafening sound. He barely registered the figure that appeared above him until he saw Kara's face, bloodied but alive, her eyes wide with fear. "Jimmy," she gasped, her voice shaky. We can't keep fighting." The words felt like a punch to the gut, but in that moment, Jimmy made his decision. "We're not quitting," he said, his voice low but resolute. He reached out, his hand gripping hers as he helped her back to her feet. "We're going to fight until we can't fight anymore, and then we'll find a way." Kara looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and something deeper. It was the look of someone who had been fighting for so long that they had forgotten how to hope. But now, with Jimmy by her side, she remembered what it felt like to believe again. Together they would face whatever came next. Together they would stand until the end. The world outside the palace was chaos. The dark sky was filled with the flash of distant explosions, the air thick with smoke. But for Sergeant Jimmy Mitchell and Empress Kara, the noise seemed distant. The sounds of war, the screams of battle, they were all fading into the background as they moved swiftly through the broken corridors of the palace. Kara leaned heavily on Jimmy, her breathing shallow, her body weary from hours of fighting. He could feel her weight as she leaned on him, but he never faltered. He had promised her he would never leave, and now was no time to break that promise. "Keep going, Empress," Jimmy said, his voice steady despite the tension in his chest. His eyes kept darting over his shoulder, making sure no enemy soldiers were close. "We're almost there." Kara nodded weakly, but her eyes were filled with more than just exhaustion. They were filled with gratitude and something deeper, something Jimmy couldn't quite put into words. She had been a leader, a ruler, and yet here, in the quiet moments between the chaos, she was just another person, fragile and vulnerable. She had trusted him, and he wasn't going to let her down. The two of them had managed to fight their way through the palace, pushing back the enemy forces as best as they could. But now their escape was the only priority. The palace was lost. Her people had been scattered, and they were running out of time. "Do you think they'll find us?" Kara asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jimmy's jaw tightened as he scanned the corridor ahead. The walls were cracked and crumbling, debris scattered across the floor. It was clear that the palace was no longer the stronghold it had once been. It was a tomb waiting to happen. "I won't let them," Jimmy said firmly. "I won't let anyone take you, Empress." She looked at him, her expression softening for a moment. Her gaze lingered on his face, as if she were trying to memorize the determination in his eyes. "I never imagined my life would come to this," she whispered, her voice tinged with sadness. "To be running from my own people's fate." Jimmy's chest tightened. He understood more than she knew. He understood what it felt like to fight and lose, to be left with nothing but the bitter taste of defeat. But he also knew that they were not done yet. As long as they were breathing, there was a chance. "It's not over yet," Jimmy said, his voice quiet but filled with conviction. "Not for you, not for us." They rounded a corner, and ahead of them was a narrow, dimly lit hallway that led to the palace's secret exit. It was their last hope, the only way out. But it was also the most dangerous path. The enemy knew about the escape route, and they would be waiting. "We'll have to fight our way through," Jimmy said, his mind racing. "Can you make it?" Kara glanced down at her energy blade, her fingers trembling on the hilt. The weight of the weapon seemed heavier than it ever had before, but her gaze was resolute. "I will fight." Together they approached the exit, their footsteps echoing eerily in the silence that hung between the bursts of battle. They moved carefully, quietly, each step calculated. Jimmy's senses were on high alert. He knew that if they were discovered now, there would be no way out. When they reached the door that led to the escape route, Jimmy paused, his hand hovering over the control panel. He could feel Kara's presence behind him, her strength still unwavering, even though her body was on the edge of collapse. He knew this wasn't just about saving her life. It was about saving whatever hope they had left. "Stay close," he whispered, hitting the button to open the door. It slid open with a quiet hiss, revealing the dark, narrow tunnel beyond. They stepped inside and the door closed silently behind them. The air was cool, but the stillness of the tunnel felt almost oppressive. There was no going back now. The only way out was forward. But as they moved deeper into the shadows, Jimmy heard something, a faint sound. The shuffle of footsteps, the crackling of weapons being charged. They weren't alone. "They're coming," Jimmy whispered urgently. Kara's hand tightened around her blade. "We have to move faster." They picked up their pace, running down the dark tunnel, the walls seeming to close in on them. Jimmy's heart pounded in his chest, his instincts telling him that they were being hunted. The enemy was close, too close. And then in the dim light ahead, Jimmy saw them. The enemy soldiers, standing in the tunnel's narrow path, blocking their way. "Get back," one of the soldiers shouted, raising his weapon. Without a second thought, Jimmy fired. The blast hit the soldier square in the chest, and he crumpled to the ground. Kara was already moving, her energy blade cutting through the air as she took down another soldier. But there were too many for them to take on alone. The sound of the enemy's weapons charging grew louder and Jimmy's pulse raced. They couldn't keep fighting like this. They had to get out. "Go," Jimmy shouted, pulling Kara toward him as he fired another shot. He could see the exit just ahead, but it felt miles away. With Kara at his side, they ran, faster than ever, their feet pounding against the stone floor. The enemy was closing in, but they didn't stop. They couldn't. Finally, they reached the end of the tunnel. A small, dimly lit shuttle sat waiting for them, the last chance for survival. Jimmy motioned for Kara to go first, then climbed in behind her, closing the hatch just as a blast from the enemy's weapon struck the door. The shuttle lurched to life, and with a burst of speed it shot into the sky, leaving the shattered palace behind. As the planet below grew smaller, Jimmy finally allowed himself to breathe. They had escaped. They had survived, but the fight was far from over. And as long as they had each other, there was hope. The shuttle soared through the stars, its engines humming softly as it left the burning planet behind. The darkness of space stretched endlessly before them, a vast, quiet void that felt both endless and final. Jimmy Mitchell sat at the controls, his eyes focused on the stars ahead, but his mind was still on the battle they had just escaped. His hands, though steady on the shuttle's controls, were trembling. The adrenaline was wearing off, and with it, the reality of what had just happened began to settle in. Beside him, Empress Kara sat in silence, her gaze fixed on the small view screen in front of her. Her once pristine armor was marred by dirt and blood, her silver hair wild and unkempt, but there was a strength in her silence, a quiet determination. She had seen her world crumble, watched as everything she had fought for had been torn apart. But she hadn't given up. She hadn't abandoned her people, even when they had abandoned her. Jimmy glanced at her, seeing the exhaustion in her eyes, the weight of the world still pressing down on her shoulders. She was no longer the proud, untouchable ruler he had first met. Now she was just a woman like him, vulnerable and lost. "Empress," he said, his voice soft, breaking the heavy silence, "we're safe, for now." Kara turned to him slowly, her violet eyes searching his face, as if trying to find something in him, something that might offer her the comfort she so desperately needed. She didn't speak immediately, but the sadness in her eyes told Jimmy everything he needed to know. "I never imagined it would come to this," she whispered. "My people, my empire gone in a matter of hours. I failed them, Sergeant." Jimmy's heart ached at her words. He wanted to tell her it wasn't her fault, that she had done everything she could, but he knew that wouldn't be enough. Not for someone like her. She had given everything, fought to the very end, and still, she felt like she had lost. "You didn't fail anyone," he said, his voice firm. "You fought for them, for all of us. You gave everything you had. That's not failure, Empress. That's strength." She met his gaze, her lips trembling slightly as if she wanted to say something but didn't have the words. In that moment, Jimmy realized how much they had both lost. They had both fought for something bigger than themselves, Kara for her people and Jimmy for her, for the hope that they could still build something better, something that hadn't been destroyed in the flames of war. Kara finally spoke, her voice quieter now. "And what do we do now? Where do we go from here?" The question hung in the air, heavier than any weapon, more dangerous than any enemy. There were no easy answers, no simple solutions. They had escaped, but they hadn't won. Not yet. The fight for her people's future was just beginning, and neither of them knew what it would cost. "We take it one step at a time," Jimmy said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty in his chest. "We find somewhere safe, regroup. We need to heal, both of us. Then we figure out what to do next. There's still hope, Empress. We just have to believe that." She looked at him, her eyes softening. "You're right. There's always a way forward, isn't there?" Jimmy nodded, his heart swelling with something he couldn't quite name. He had never expected to find himself in this position, standing side by side with an alien Empress, fighting for a future neither of them could fully see. And yet, here they were, survivors of something that should have broken them both, clinging to the faintest spark of hope. The shuttle drifted silently through the cold vacuum of space, leaving behind the ruins of Kara's empire and the ghosts of all they had lost. But ahead there was a new future, one they would have to build together, step by step. There would be no turning back. They had come too far. Kara turned back to the controls, her expression more resolute than before. "What now?" she asked, the edge of her former strength returning. "What do we do to rebuild?" Jimmy felt the weight of her question, but he also felt something else, determination. She wasn't giving up, not now, and neither was he. "We rebuild," Jimmy said, his voice strong. "We gather what's left. We find others who believe in the same thing we do, and we make them see that it's not over, not for us, not for your people, and not for the galaxy." For the first time in a long while, Kara allowed herself a small smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The road ahead would be long and the challenges would be greater than either of them could imagine. But in that moment, Jimmy knew one thing: they would face it together. And that was enough to keep going. The stars outside the shuttle's window seemed to shine just a little bit brighter now, as if offering a sign, a small glimmer of light in the darkness. It wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning. And with that, the two of them set their course, not just to survive, but to rebuild, to fight for a future, and to find their way forward. Together. The shuttle glided silently through the vastness of space, the stars outside shimmering like tiny beacons in the endless darkness. Inside, the hum of the engines was the only sound that filled the air. Jimmy Mitchell sat at the controls, his hands steady, but his mind far from calm. His eyes flicked over the console, checking the readings, but he was really looking for something more. Anything to bring him comfort, anything to distract from the weight of what had happened. Beside him, Empress Kara sat silently, her gaze fixed on the stars outside the small viewport. Her once pristine armor was scratched and battered, a symbol of the battles she had fought, but it wasn't just the armor that bore the marks of war. Her face was drawn, tired. The quiet sadness in her eyes seemed to tell the story of everything they had lost. Jimmy's heart ached for her, but he knew one thing: he wasn't going to let her face this alone. Not anymore. The palace they had once defended was now nothing but rubble, and her people scattered. But together they had escaped. Together they had survived. "We're out of their reach now," Jimmy said, his voice steady, though it didn't feel steady inside. "For now, we're safe." Kara didn't respond at first. Her silence was telling. She wasn't just thinking about her own survival, she was thinking about everything else. Her people, the war, the future. She had been a ruler, a leader of millions, and now, with everything gone, she was left with nothing but the hope that something could be rebuilt. "Where do we go from here?" she asked softly, breaking the silence. Her voice was tired, almost resigned. Jimmy glanced at her, seeing the weight of her question. He knew she wasn't asking about a physical destination. She was asking about the future, about what came after all of this. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice low. "But we'll figure it out. We always do. We'll find a way." Kara turned to him then, her violet eyes meeting his. There was a depth to her gaze that caught him off guard. It wasn't just the weight of being a ruler. It wasn't just about the loss. It was something more personal, something Jimmy had only glimpsed before but never fully understood. She had always been a leader, a protector, but now she was a woman who had lost everything, and yet somehow still had something left to fight for. "Do you ever wonder if it's worth it?" she asked quietly. "All of it, the fight, the loss, all the lives sacrificed." Jimmy felt the sting of her words. He had seen the destruction too, the way the hope in people's eyes had dimmed, the way entire worlds had fallen apart. The guilt weighed heavily on him as well. But what was the alternative? To give up? To let the world fall into darkness without even trying? "I think it's worth it," he said, his voice more sure now. "As long as we keep fighting, it's worth it. For the ones who are still here, for the ones who believe in something better, it's worth it to keep going." Kara's gaze softened. Her hand rested lightly on the console in front of her, her fingers brushing against the cold metal. It was a small gesture, but it was enough for Jimmy to understand. She wasn't just the Empress anymore. She was a woman who had fought for her people, who had done everything she could, and yet had never stopped trying to believe in something more. "You've been fighting beside me all this time," Kara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But there's more to this fight than just surviving, isn't there?" Jimmy looked at her, his expression serious. "There has to be. There has to be more. We can't just give up now. You've shown me that, Empress. You've shown me that it's not just about the fight, it's about the people we protect. It's about what we leave behind." She met his eyes, and in that moment, something shifted between them. She had always been a ruler, someone with the weight of an empire on her shoulders, but now she was a woman who had learned the meaning of trust and of fighting for something worth protecting. "We'll find a way to rebuild," Kara said, her voice more determined than it had been in days. "We'll find others, people who still believe in hope, in peace. We'll rebuild everything we've lost." Jimmy nodded, his heart lighter. It was a promise, not just from her but from both of them. They had lost so much, but as long as they had each other, they still had a chance. And maybe that was all they needed, to keep going, to keep fighting, and to find a way forward. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet of space settled around them, the shuttle cutting through the darkness like a beacon in the void. There was no guarantee of what the future would hold, no certainty of the battles that lay ahead. But in this moment, there was hope. The kind of hope that comes from knowing that, no matter what, they would face it together. "We'll get through this," Jimmy said, his voice steady, his eyes fixed on the stars ahead. "We'll make it." Kara's lips curled into the smallest of smiles, a rare moment of warmth. "Together," she said, the words carrying a strength that rang true in her heart. Together, that was enough.